Daniel Clayton, a stoic veteran, opens his Oregon ranch to Jesse Turner, a struggling ex-soldier, and his freezing family, stranded in a broken van. Ignoring skeptical neighbors, Daniel sacrifices his savings to provide them shelter and supplies. As Jesse grapples with guilt over a fatal ambush in Afghanistan, a military convoy arrives, revealing a shocking truth. Jesse's actions saved lives, earning him a Bronze Star. But who sent the convoy, and why now? As the town watches, secrets unravel, and Daniel's quiet compassion sparks a reckoning. Will Jesse's redemption rewrite his future, or is something bigger at play? If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to support our channel. Your engagement helps us share more stories of compassion and courage. Join our community, leave a comment with your own experiences, and let's inspire each other to make a difference. Thank you for watching. The wind howled across Daniel Clayton's eastern Oregon ranch, sharp and unrelenting, carrying the mocking laughter of his neighbor. "What, you running a charity for strays now?" The neighbor's voice sliced through the cold, laced with a cruelty that stung more than the frost. Daniel stood motionless, his boots planted in the frozen earth, hands buried in the pockets of his worn flannel jacket. His hazel eyes, sharp as ever despite his 70 years, traced the horizon where the wind tore through the sparse grass. Those eyes had seen things: sandstorms in Iraq, the chaos of war, the quiet agony of loss, and now they held a steady vigil over his land. Behind him, near the sagging barn, a veteran's family stood huddled against the cold. Their thin coats were no match for the biting chill, and their eyes carried the weight of exhaustion, of a life stripped bare. A baby's cough, frail but insistent, broke the silence, each sound a tiny plea that seemed to echo in Daniel's soul. Their only possessions were a rusted van that barely ran and a folded military uniform, its creases pristine but its meaning ignored by a world too busy to care. Then a low growl of engines pierced the morning mist, growing louder until 3 black SUVs emerged, followed by the heavy rumble of military trucks. They halted at the gate, doors opening with military precision. Soldiers in dress uniforms stepped out, forming a disciplined line, their faces carved with purpose. The neighbors, who had jeered just moments before, now stood in stunned silence, their taunts swallowed by the weight of what they were witnessing. These soldiers weren't here on a whim. They had come for someone this town had long since forgotten, someone whose quiet existence had faded into the background of their small, insular world. Daniel Clayton was not a man who craved attention. At 70, he moved with a slow, deliberate gait, the kind forged by decades of ranch work and the unyielding discipline of military life. His hands, rough and etched with the lines of hard labor, told stories of fences mended, sheep tended, and battles fought in far-off deserts. His back was stiff, a testament to time's toll, but his spirit remained unbroken. A retired Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army, with 23 years of service, Daniel carried his past quietly. Upstairs in a cedar chest, medals lay tucked away, silent testaments to courage and sacrifice he never spoke of. To him, they weren't badges of honor, but heavy reminders of a life he'd left behind, buried beneath the simplicity of flannel shirts, patched boots, and the rhythmic routine of sheep ranching. 6 years ago, his world had shattered. Margaret, his wife of 44 years, had been his compass, her warmth guiding him through every storm. Cancer stole her slowly, its cruelty matched only by the silence it left behind. When she was gone, the farmhouse felt hollow, its walls echoing with memories Daniel couldn't escape. He wasn't just a widower, he was a man cut loose from his moorings, adrift in a grief so profound it seemed to swallow the light. The heart surgery a year later carved more than his chest. It drained his savings and forced him to sell off most of his flock. Once, 300 sheep had grazed across his 90 acres. Now only 40 remained. He kept them not for profit, but for purpose, their presence a reason to rise each morning when the silence threatened to overwhelm him. Daniel's life was one of quiet simplicity. His pension checks arrived like clockwork on the 3rd of each month. Every 2 weeks, he drove to town for groceries, buying only what he needed, nothing more. A black and white photo of Margaret sat by the kitchen stove, her smile a beacon in the dimness of his days. Each evening he spoke to her, a soft joke to coax a memory of her laughter, a fleeting recollection of their life together, or simply a whispered "Good night, Maggie." It was his ritual, a thread connecting him to the love that had shaped him. The townsfolk respected Daniel, though they weren't sure what to make of him. He didn't join them at church, didn't linger at the diner to trade gossip, didn't idle at the feed store to swap stories. But when a storm tore through and left a roof in tatters, or when floodwaters threatened cattle, Daniel was there, his old Ford rattling up with a tool belt and a thermos of black coffee. He was quiet, stubborn about right and wrong, a man of few words but unwavering principle. Honor to Daniel wasn't a buzzword or a hashtag. It was how you treated people when no one was watching. He had no use for social media or the shallow gestures of a world obsessed with appearances. His kindness was tangible, rooted in action, not applause. So when a man like Daniel Clayton, a man who had buried his past, who had spent a lifetime doing right in the shadows, chose to stand for a family the world had passed by, it was a moment that carried a weight beyond words. The veteran's family, shivering by the barn, wasn't just a group of strangers. They were a mirror to Daniel's own sacrifices, a reminder of the battles he'd fought and the losses he'd endured. As the soldiers stood at his gate, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of a debt long ignored, Daniel felt a surge of pride and sorrow intertwined. He hadn't sought their recognition, but he would stand for those the world had forgotten. Just as he always had, his heart steady, even as it bore the weight of a lifetime's worth of quiet valor. The wind shifted, sharp and restless, slicing through the late afternoon with a bite that promised snow. Daniel Clayton didn't need to glance at the sky to know a storm was brewing. He'd lived on this Wyoming ranch his whole life, long enough to read the land's quiet signals. The way the pines stood unnaturally still, their branches heavy with anticipation, the air crackling with an electric tension that made the hairs on his arms stand up. Snow would hit hard within the hour, blanketing the hills in a merciless white shroud. He'd just finished wrestling with the barn roof, reinforcing it against the coming gale, when a sound cut through the silence, a sputtering, choking cough of an engine on its last legs. Wiping his calloused hands on a frayed rag, Daniel stepped onto the porch, his bad knees groaning with each movement. Squinting toward the tree line, he spotted it. A beat-up minivan, gray and rusted, limping through the snow like a wounded animal. It crawled down the gravel driveway, tires slipping in the fresh powder, before giving out completely about 50 feet past the gate. A final, pitiful rattle echoed. Then silence. Steam hissed from the hood, curling into the frigid air like a ghost. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out, bracing himself against the wind's relentless push. Tall and lean, his face unshaven, he wore a military surplus jacket that hung loosely on his frame, too big, like it belonged to someone else's life. His boots were scuffed, the soles worn thin, but it was his eyes that caught Daniel's attention, sharp, scanning the horizon with a vigilance that never slept, yet sunken, hollowed out by something deeper than exhaustion. Not the hollow of a man lost to drink or despair. Daniel had seen that plenty in his years. This was different. This was the look of a man who'd poured every ounce of himself into the fight and still came up empty, like the world had made a promise it never intended to keep. "Afternoon," Daniel called out, his voice steady, measured, cutting through the wind. The man raised a hand, a cautious gesture, and trudged closer. "Sorry to just show up like this," he said, his voice rough, scraped raw by the cold and days on the road. "We've been driving 3 days straight, coming up from Kansas. Cars dead, no heat, no gasoline, no food. Just looking for somewhere warm while I figure out how to fix it." His words carried a quiet desperation, not begging, but worn thin, like he'd repeated this plea too many times to strangers who'd turned him away. He hesitated, glancing back at the van where the passenger door opened. A woman stepped out, clutching a bundled infant to her chest. The baby was wrapped in a threadbare blanket, its edges frayed and barely holding together. She moved carefully, her face pale, her eyes darting between her husband and Daniel, as if bracing for rejection. Her arms curled tighter around the child, shielding it from the wind's bite. And when the baby let out a sharp, dry cough, her whole body tensed, a flicker of fear passing over her face. Two more children climbed out of the van, a girl, maybe 8, and a boy around 6. They were thin, their cheeks flushed red from the cold, their eyes wide but silent as they clung to their mother's coat, huddling close like frightened sparrows. The girl's coat was too small, her wrist poking out, raw and chapped. The boy's shoes were mismatched, one lace missing, and he kept his head down, as if afraid to meet Daniel's gaze. Daniel descended the porch steps slowly, his knees protesting with every creak. He didn't rush, didn't need to. He studied the man's posture, the way he stood, feet planted, shoulders squared but not aggressive, his eyes sweeping the surroundings with a trained, instinctive caution. Muscle memory, combat reflexes that never faded, no matter how long it had been since the last mission. Daniel recognized it because he'd lived it. "What's your name?" he asked, stopping a few feet away, close enough to see the man's breath cloud in the cold. "Jesse Turner," the man replied, his voice steady despite the chill. "82nd Airborne, 2 tours in Afghanistan." The words carried weight, a shorthand that needed no explanation. Daniel nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. "Clayton, Sergeant First Class, Desert Storm." No more needed to be said. The silence between them spoke louder than words, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of war, a code that didn't require elaboration. Daniel's gaze shifted to the family. The baby coughed again, a sound that cut through the wind, and the mother's arms tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line of worry. The children stood closer to her, their small hands gripping her coat, their eyes flickering with a mix of hope and fear, as if they'd learned too young that kindness was rare and fleeting. "I've got an old bunkhouse," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. "It's rough, but it's got a stove, and it'll keep the wind out." Jesse's face froze, stunned, like he hadn't expected the offer. "Sir, we can't pay," he said, the words heavy with shame, his eyes dropping for a moment before meeting Daniel's again. "Didn't ask for money," Daniel cut in, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Get your family out of this cold." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifeline, a rare moment of grace in a world that had offered Jesse little of it. In that instant, something shifted in Jesse's eyes. A flicker of disbelief, then gratitude so raw it almost hurt to see. For 3 days he'd driven through snow and ice, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind racing with what-ifs. Every gas station, every diner, every fleeting stop had been a reminder of how close they were to breaking. The van's heater had given out first, then the gas gauge had dipped to empty, and the last of their food, a half-empty bag of crackers, had been rationed between the kids. Each locked door, each averted gaze from strangers, had chipped away at the hope he'd clung to for his family. He'd promised his wife, Ellie, that they'd find somewhere safe, somewhere warm, but with every mile, that promise felt more like a lie. Now, standing in this stranger's driveway, with snow stinging his face and his children shivering behind him, Jesse felt the weight of Daniel's words, like a hand pulling him back from the edge. Daniel turned, leading the way to the bunkhouse, a squat, one-room cabin tucked behind the barn. His father had built it in the 1960s for hired hands during lambing season. A no-frill shelter with a slanted roof that mostly held and a wood stove that groaned but still worked. It hadn't been used in years, its walls coated in dust and cobwebs, but it was enough. Daniel grabbed an armful of firewood from the stack by the barn, his shoulders aching under the weight, while Jesse carried the baby inside, Ellie and the children trailing close behind. The girl, Lily, kept her eyes on her father, her small hand clutching her brother's, as if afraid to let go. The boy, Sam, stayed silent, his gaze fixed on the ground, but his shoulders relaxed slightly as they stepped into the shelter of the bunkhouse, out of the wind's relentless howl. Inside, the air was stale but warm, the stove's faint glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Daniel swept out the dust himself, his movements steady and deliberate, while Jesse unloaded their meager belongings, a duffel bag stuffed with worn clothes, a dented tin of formula for the baby, and a folded map creased from countless hours of planning a route that had led them here. Ellie sat on the edge of a cot, rocking the baby gently, her face a mix of exhaustion and guarded hope. She hadn't spoken yet, but her eyes followed Daniel's every move, searching for the catch, the hidden cost of this kindness. She'd seen too many promises turn sour, too many doors slam shut. But as the stove's warmth began to fill the room, thawing the chill in her bones, a small part of her dared to believe this might be real. For Jesse, the bunkhouse felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. He'd grown accustomed to rejection, to the way people's eyes slid away when they saw his family's desperation. 2 tours in Afghanistan had left him with scars no one could see, a constant hum of vigilance that never quieted, and a resume that didn't translate to civilian life. He'd tried everything: odd jobs, late-night applications, promises to Ellie that things would get better. But the world had kept shutting them out, and now, with his children's faces pinched from hunger and cold, he'd felt the last threads of his strength fraying. Yet here, in this stranger's bunkhouse, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of his baby's cough softening in the warmth, Jesse felt something he hadn't in years, a flicker of possibility, fragile but real. Daniel worked in silence, stacking firewood by the stove, his own thoughts churning. He'd been alone on this ranch since his wife passed 5 years ago, the solitude both a comfort and a weight. He'd seen men like Jesse before, veterans carrying the ghosts of wars they couldn't leave behind, men who'd given everything and come home to a world that didn't know what to do with them. Daniel had been luckier than most. He'd had this land, this ranch, a tether to keep him grounded. But he knew the look in Jesse's eyes, the way it felt to carry a debt you could never repay, not to a bank or a government, but to yourself, to the family you'd sworn to protect. As he glanced at the children, their small faces lit by the stove's glow, Daniel felt a pang of something he couldn't name, grief maybe, or memory, or just the recognition of a shared fight. No questions were asked, no explanations needed. Just 2 men, shaped by different wars, bound by the same unspoken code. For Jesse's family, this was more than shelter. It was a moment of respite, a chance to breathe. For Daniel, it was a reminder that even in the coldest storm, there was still warmth to be shared. The snow began to fall outside, thick and unrelenting. But inside the bunkhouse, the world felt a little less heavy. The American flag fluttered gently in the crisp morning air, its stars and stripes a quiet testament to resilience. No one in the small, weathered farmhouse voiced complaints or demands. Only a soft, unspoken gratitude hung in the air, as delicate as the frost clinging to the windows. By dusk, tendrils of smoke spiraled from the stovepipe, curling into the twilight like a promise of warmth. Inside, the children huddled close to the crackling fire, their small faces glowing in the flickering light. Their mother, weary but tender, ladled steaming soup into their bowls, each spoonful a labor of love crafted by Daniel from scratch. The baby, nestled in a blanket, slept soundly at last, her raspy cough softened by the radiant heat. Jesse, the father, glanced at the sagging fence out back, its splintered posts leaning like tired soldiers. "I can fix that tomorrow," he offered, his voice rough but earnest. Daniel, stirring the pot, shook his head. "Rest," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jesse nodded, his shoulders slumping, with a gratitude he couldn't quite voice, a weight of exhaustion and relief mingling in his chest. The next morning, Daniel climbed into his truck, the engine grumbling to life as he headed into town. The road stretched before him, dusted with fresh snow, and his mind churned with purpose. At the feed store, he loaded the truck bed with heavy sacks of grain and bales of hay, each one a commitment to the days ahead. At the general store, he moved with quiet determination, piling his cart with practical necessities and small kindnesses: sturdy boots to replace worn-out soles, thick coats to ward off the biting cold, diapers for the baby, medicine for her cough, canned goods to stock the pantry, a space heater to chase away the chill, a bright red sled for the kids to spark joy in the snow, and a pair of wool gloves small enough to fit a boy's hands. His hands lingered on the gloves, imagining the boy's shy smile when he slipped them on. At the bank, the teller's eyes widened as she read the withdrawal slip. "All of it, Mr. Clayton?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Your entire savings?" Daniel's pen scratched across the form, his signature steady. "Figure I won't be taking it with me," he said, his voice calm but resolute, as if he'd already made peace with the decision. The teller hesitated, but Daniel's gaze held no doubt, only a quiet conviction that this was right. Word traveled fast in a town this small. By the time Daniel finished loading the truck, whispers buzzed like static. At the gas station, Frank, a grizzled rancher from down the road, leaned out his window, his voice sharp with curiosity. "You housing transients now, Clayton?" Daniel didn't answer, his jaw tight as he backed out, the truck's tires crunching against the gravel. He wasn't here to explain himself. His focus was on the family waiting back at the ranch, their faces etched in his mind. That afternoon, as Daniel stacked the supplies in the bunkhouse doorway, the sound of tires on snow announced his daughter's arrival. Rebecca stepped out of her car, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. At 42, she carried herself with the no-nonsense authority of a middle school principal, her practicality a shield against the world's chaos. Behind her came Michael, her husband, buttoned up and meticulous, the kind of man who double-checked thermostats and kept his doubts neatly organized. His work in insurance had honed his instinct for risk, and his furrowed brow betrayed his unease. "Dad," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the cold as she nodded toward Jesse, who was chopping wood shirtless despite the biting chill, his breath clouding in the air. "What's going on here?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, but it carried the weight of concern, of a daughter who'd watched her father give too much before. Daniel handed her a pair of gloves, his movement steady. "They're staying in the bunkhouse," he said. "The kids were half frozen when they got here. Needed a roof, warmth, food." Michael's eyes narrowed, calculating. "You gave them shelter," he said, his voice measured. "And what else? Stanley at the store said you dropped $4,000 on supplies." Daniel leaned against the tailgate, his weathered hands resting on the cold metal. "They needed it," he said simply, but the words carried a depth of conviction that silenced the air for a moment. Rebecca's frown deepened, her mind racing with practical worries. Bills, savings, the fragility of her father's generosity. "You barely know them," she said, her voice softer now, laced with a daughter's fear for her father's future. Daniel's gaze drifted to the bunkhouse, where the faint glow of light spilled through the window. "I know enough," he said. "He served. He's got a family to feed. That's more than most folks have going for him." His words weren't defensive, they were a quiet declaration, rooted in a sense of duty and that ran deeper than logic. Michael shook his head, his voice low but firm. "You can't save everybody, Daniel." The older man's eyes met his son-in-law's, steady and unyielding. "I'm not trying to, just this one family." The wind picked up, swirling snow off the roof in a gust that stung their faces. No one spoke for a long moment, the silence heavy with unspoken fears and convictions. Rebecca's shoulders tensed, her mind wrestling with the recklessness of her father's choice. "You're risking everything," she said finally, her voice breaking just enough to reveal the love beneath her frustration. Daniel nodded, his expression soft but unyielding. "Then let it be for something that matters." His words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to their doubts. Rebecca and Michael didn't argue further, but when they drove away, the silence between them was thick with unresolved tension, a daughter's worry clashing with a father's resolve. Inside the bunkhouse, the air was warm with life. Laughter, soft and almost miraculous, spilled out, a sound that seemed impossible just days ago. The children, no longer shivering, played with a lightness that filled the small space with hope. Daniel stood outside, listening, and the sound wrapped around his heart like a gift. Every dollar spent, every risk taken, felt worth it in that moment, a quiet victory against the cold. Later, as snow continued to fall, Daniel and Jesse sat on the porch, each cradling a mug of black coffee that had long gone cold. The wind had quieted and the sky glowed with a pale, fragile light, as if the world were holding its breath. They sat in companionable silence, two men carrying their own burdens, their own scars. Jesse's gaze fixed on the frost-covered fields, his voice low when he finally spoke. "You ever carry something so long, it becomes part of who you are?" he asked, his words heavy with memory. "Like a scar you forget about until someone bumps it." Daniel didn't respond, just waited, his silence an invitation for Jesse to unburden himself. Jesse's eyes grew distant, lost in a past that still haunted him. "I was discharged early," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Kandahar, 2013. Routine convoy inspection near an Allied outpost. I was comms, supposed to catch anything off, but I didn't. Not that day. His voice cracked and he paused, swallowing hard. Ambush took our Colonel David Garner. Smart guy, steady. Knew every kid's name, remembered birthdays. The kind of man who'd make you want to be better. Jesse's hands tightened around his mug, his knuckles white. I should have seen it coming. Should have heard something. Anything. But I didn't. The weight of that failure pressed against him, a scar that ached in the quiet moments, a guilt he carried like a shadow. Daniel listened, his own heart heavy with memories of choices made and chances taken. He didn't offer platitudes or try to fix the unfixable. Instead, he let the silence stretch, a shared understanding between two men who knew the cost of living with scars. The snow fell softly around them, blanketing the world in quiet, and for a moment, the weight of their burdens felt just a little lighter, shared in the stillness of the night. Daniel's coffee mug hit the table with a soft thud, steam rising in lazy spirals against the chill of the morning. The name Garner landed like a grenade in his chest, detonating memories he'd long tried to bury. It wasn't just a name, it was a tether to a past he had never fully escaped. He glanced at Jesse, whose face was a map of anguish, his breath uneven as if the weight of that name had stolen the air from his lungs. Jesse's voice trembled, each word a confession carved from years of silent suffering. I was sure they'd haul me off to a court-martial, strip me of everything. But they didn't. Just an administrative discharge. No parade, no pat on the back. Just silence, like I'd never existed. He exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around his mug until his knuckles paled. That guilt's been my shadow ever since. Alicia tells me to move on, but she didn't see Garner lying there, blood soaking the ground. I was supposed to keep him alive, Daniel. That was my one job. Daniel's eyes drifted to the hills, their snow-capped crests glowing faintly under the dawn. He stayed silent, the quiet stretching like a fragile thread between them. His mind was a storm of memories, sand and smoke, the scream of metal, and Garner's voice cutting through it all. Garner, First Lieutenant David Garner, Fort Bragg, Desert Storm, a name that carried the weight of a life owed. Jesse's head whipped toward him, eyes wide with shock. You knew him? Knew him? Daniel's voice was low, gravelly, the corner of his mouth twitching with a flicker of grief and disbelief as if fate had played a cruel trick. He saved my life in '91 outside Alfie. My Humvee was an inferno, my shoulder shattered. Garner pulled me out, bullets flying, dust choking the air, said I owed him a steak dinner back home. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but he blinked them back, his jaw tight. Jesse stared, his breath hitching as he fought the tears welling in his eyes. He never told me that. Not a word. Daniel's lips curved in a faint, wistful smile. He wouldn't. That was Garner. Never one to boast, just did what needed doing. The silence that followed was holy, a shared reverence for a man whose shadow still bound them. Jesse's voice dropped to a whisper, raw and desperate. Do you think I let him down? Daniel's gaze softened, but his words were steady, piercing Jesse's fog of self-blame. You're still here, Jesse. That's what he'd want. You to live to make that life mean something. I know guilt. It's a brutal load, but carrying it forever doesn't make you stronger. It just grinds you to dust. Jesse stared into his cold coffee, his grip on the mug so tight it seemed it might crack. Why'd you take us in, Daniel, really? You didn't know any of this when we showed up. Daniel nodded, his eyes distant, seeing something beyond the snow-draped ranch. I didn't, but maybe this is the debt I've been waiting to repay. Garner gave me my life. You're part of his story, Jesse, and I don't abandon a man. Not then, not now. A soft breeze stirred, sending snow swirling from the porch rail. Inside the bunkhouse, a baby's cough broke the stillness, followed by Alicia's gentle lullaby, its melody weaving through the quiet. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a bond forged in loss, guilt, and gratitude. One carried blame, the other memory. Now they carried each other. The morning had begun like any other, cold, still, cloaked in the soft hush of new snow. Jesse was already outside, shovel scraping against the gravel driveway, his movements steady but mechanical, his mind lost in the rhythm of the task. Inside, Alicia was at the old stove, warming formula, her hands deft but her heart heavy with the uncertainty of their future. Daniel stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the world unfold as he always did, letting the silence speak louder than words. Then a low rumble broke the peace, faint at first, like a storm brewing. He squinted, scanning the horizon. The sound grew, rolling across the snow-draped fields like thunder. Through the bomb, a black SUV emerged, its tires crunching against the frozen gravel. Then another and a third. Behind them, two military transport trucks loomed, their engines growling. They didn't pause at the mailbox. They drove straight up, stopping just feet from where Jesse stood, his shovel frozen, his pulse racing. Doors opened in unison. From the lead SUV stepped a tall woman, her overcoat sharp against her crisp military dress uniform. A colonel, her gaze sweeping the scene with battlefield precision. From the second SUV, an older man emerged, his movements weighted by time and rank, the stars of a general glinting faintly on his shoulders. The clink of General Daniel Harlan's coffee cup against the saucer echoed in the frosty morning air, a sound so ordinary it seemed out of place in the moment that was unfolding. He set it down with a deliberate slowness, his weathered hand steady, though his heart thumped with the weight of what was to come. Outside, the crunch of boots on snow announced the arrival of the soldiers, stepping from their vehicles with a precision that spoke of discipline and purpose. They formed a silent line along the driveway of the remote Montana ranch, their uniforms stark against the white landscape, their faces carved with solemnity. The morning, which had begun with the mundane rhythm of chores, had spiraled into something surreal, something that felt like it belonged in a dream or a nightmare. Jesse Turner stood frozen, his gloved hand still wrapped around the handle of the shovel he'd been using to clear a path through the snow. The cold bit at his knuckles, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the scene before him. His breath caught in his chest, a sharp pang of unease twisting through him. He didn't move, didn't speak, as if any sudden action might shatter the fragile reality unfolding. His hazel eyes, shadowed by years of guilt and sleepless nights, darted from the soldiers to the general, searching for a clue, a reason for this unexpected intrusion into his quiet, self-imposed exile. At the doorway of the small ranch house, Alicia stood, her arms cradling their infant daughter, the baby's soft gurgles a stark contrast to the tension in the air. Her dark hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and her eyes, wide with a mix of fear and curiosity, locked onto the scene. Behind her, their two older children, Emma and Caleb, peered out, their young faces pale, their gazes fixed on the line of soldiers. Emma clutched the hem of her mother's sweater, her small fingers trembling, while Caleb stood rigid, his jaw tight, trying to mimic the stoicism he had seen in his father. Alicia's heart pounded, a mother's instinct screaming that something monumental was happening, though she couldn't yet grasp what it was. All she knew was that the life they'd built here, fragile, hard-won, and shadowed by Jesse's past, was about to change. General Harlan stepped forward, his presence commanding despite the simplicity of his movements. His voice, steady and resonant, cut through the cold like the beat of a war drum. "Sergeant Jesse Turner," he said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to settle over the entire ranch. "You've been carrying a burden that was never yours to bear." The words hit Jesse like a physical blow, his knees nearly buckling under the sudden rush of confusion and dread. He blinked, his mind scrambling to process the general's statement. I don't understand, sir," he stammered, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. The shovel slipped slightly in his grip, the metal scraping against the icy ground. Colonel Amelia Winters, a tall woman with sharp features and an air of unyielding authority, stepped up beside the general. In her hands, she held a sealed leather portfolio, its edges worn but pristine, as if it had been waiting for this moment. "Your letter to Colonel Garner's widow," she said, her voice calm but firm, "was passed up the chain of command. It prompted a review." Jesse's heart sank, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. That letter, he'd written it in the dead of night, his hands shaking, his soul raw with guilt. It was meant for her eyes alone, a desperate attempt to confess his regret, to apologize for the failure he believed was his. "That letter wasn't for anyone else," he said. his voice cracking. "I just needed her to know I was sorry." The general's expression softened, just for a moment, his eyes betraying a flicker of empathy. "She knew," he said gently. "She also knew the truth. And now, so do we." Jesse's gaze swept over the soldiers, their uniforms crisp, the flags on their shoulders catching the weak winter light, their boots polished despite the snow. The sight overwhelmed him, and his knees wobbled again. Daniel, his old friend and neighbor who had been watching silently from the sidelines, was at his side in an instant, his calloused hand gripping Jesse's arm. "Easy, son," Daniel murmured, his voice low and steady, grounding Jesse in the moment. The older man's eyes were glassy, his own emotions barely held in check as he sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. The general nodded toward the transport trucks parked along the driveway, their engines still ticking as they cooled in the frigid air. "We didn't come here to shame you," he said, his tone resolute. "We came to set the record straight." For Jesse, who had spent years haunted by the ghosts of Kandahar, the screams, the blood, the weight of decisions made in the chaos of war, this moment felt like a reckoning. The silence he'd lived in, the shame he'd carried like a second skin, was unraveling before his eyes. Redemption, it seemed, had arrived in full military formation, unyielding and undeniable. Colonel Winters opened the leather portfolio with a crisp, practiced motion, as if she had performed this ritual countless times before. But there was something different about this moment, something sacred in the stillness of the snowy ranch, surrounded by the bleating of sheep and the faint scent of pinewood smoke drifting from the chimney. She handed the first document to General Harlan, who cleared his throat, his voice taking on a tone that was less bureaucratic and more human, as if he understood the profound impact his words would have. "After Colonel Garner's passing," and he began, "the operation was sealed under classification. But recent investigations uncovered that your team in Kandahar received corrupted intelligence, fed to us by a compromised source working against U.S. forces." Jesse stood motionless, his breath shallow, his chest tight. The memories of that day flooded back. The ambush, the chaos, the desperate calls for support as he led the retreat, dragging wounded comrades to safety. He had always believed it was his failure, his inability to see through the bad intel, that had cost lives. "It wasn't your failure," Colonel Winters added, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. "It was a setup. And despite that, your actions, calling for support, leading the retreat, tending to the wounded, saved 17 men and women." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, settling over the ranch like a blanket of truth. Alicia let out a soft gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. The baby stirred in her arms, sensing her mother's emotion. Behind her, Emma's eyes widened, her small frame trembling with awe, while Caleb's stoic facade cracked, his lips quivering as he looked at his father with new understanding. Daniel lowered his head, his hands clenching into fists, his own memories of loss and survival stirring in his chest. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the faint rustle of snow falling from a nearby pine. "We're here today to correct the record," General Harlan said, his voice firm but warm. He nodded to a young lieutenant who stepped forward with a small wooden case, his movements precise but reverent. The lieutenant handed the case to Colonel Winters, who opened it with care, revealing a Bronze Star medal glinting in the pale morning light. "This," she said, her voice steady but tinged with pride, "was recommended by your commanding officer before his death. It was buried in the classified mess until now." Jesse stared at the medal, its metallic sheen a stark contrast to the dull ache in his heart. I don't know what to say," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to weigh anything, Sergeant," the general replied, his tone gentle but authoritative. "You did your duty, and it's time that's recognized." He gestured to another aide who stepped forward with a second wooden case, this one containing documents that carried their own weight. "Your discharge," the general announced, "has been formally upgraded to honorable. Retroactive benefits will be restored, including back pay, medical coverage, and family assistance." Behind him, the soldiers stood a little taller, their presence a silent testament to the truth that had finally been uncovered. For Jesse, the moment was overwhelming, a collision of past and present, guilt and absolution. The weight he'd carried for so long, the belief that he had failed his team, His country, his family, began to lift, replaced by a fragile hope. Alicia's tears fell freely now, her heart swelling with pride and relief. The children, sensing the shift, moved closer to their mother, their eyes never leaving their father. And Daniel, still gripping Jesse's arm, gave a small nod as if to say, "You're free now." The ranch, once a place of quiet exile, was now a stage for redemption, where the truth had finally found its voice. The crunch of snow under heavy boots filled the air as soldiers unloaded crates from the backs of transport trucks. Each box bore the weight of purpose, stamped with military seals, labeled with tags that promised survival. Winter supplies, children's clothing, medical kits, and food rations. The effort wasn't solitary. It was a symphony of coordination with local authorities and nonprofit networks, all woven together to ensure no one would slip through the cracks again. Colonel Winters stood tall, his voice steady but warm as he addressed Jesse Turner. "Your family's move to Idaho will be supported with housing assistance. Your children will have access to educational grants through the VA, and we'll make damn sure you're never left without care again." The words landed like a lifeline, and Alicia, Jesse's wife, pressed her hands to her mouth, her breath catching in her throat. Tears carved paths down her cheeks, glistening in the pale winter light. She turned to Jesse, her voice trembling with a hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. "We're not alone anymore," she whispered, the words fragile but fierce, as if speaking them too loudly might shatter the moment. Jesse stood rooted to the spot, his eyes tracing the scene before him. He looked at the glint of the bronze star now pinned to his worn civilian jacket, then to the soldier saluting him with quiet respect. His gaze drifted to his daughter, her small hand clutching her younger brother's as they stood by the bunkhouse door, their faces a mix of confusion and awe. Jesse's chest tightened, a knot of grief and disbelief unraveling within him. "I thought I was forgotten," he murmured, his voice so soft it barely reached the air. The words carried the weight of years spent invisible, a man haunted by war and abandoned by the world he'd fought for. Daniel Clayton, the general who had orchestrated this moment, stepped closer, his presence steady and unyielding. "You were never forgotten, Jesse," he said, his voice firm but kind, like a father speaking to a son. "You were just waiting to be found." With deliberate care, he reached out and affixed the bronze star to Jesse's jacket, right over his heart. In that instant, the world seemed to pause. The wind, which had been biting and restless, fell silent. The snowflakes, swirling moments before, hung suspended in the air. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Jesse Turner stood not as a shadow of the soldier he'd been, nor as a ghost of the war that had scarred him, but as a man fully seen, fully honored. Surrounded not by the cold judgment of a town that had turned away, but by the warm embrace of justice, he felt the weight of his past lift, if only for a moment. The sound of the convoy had done more than draw curious glances. It had stirred something deeper in the town, a ripple that grew into a wave. By the time the last crate was unloaded, pickup trucks began to appear along the edge of Daniel Clayton's fence line. Some idled cautiously, their engines rumbling with uncertainty, their drivers unsure if they belonged. Others rolled forward, gravel crunching beneath worn tires as they pulled closer. Neighbors who had once kept their distance, offering only fleeting waves or averted eyes, now stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow. They were drawn by a mix of curiosity, pride, and a nagging guilt that had begun to gnaw at their consciences. Frank Cooper, Daniel's old friend and, until recently, his most vocal critic, was the first to step forward. His boots sank into the snow, each step heavy with the burden of regret. He removed his hat, clutching it tightly as he approached, his eyes cast downward, unable to meet Jesse's gaze. Frank's eyes swept over the scene, the soldiers working in quiet efficiency, the crates brimming with aid, and finally Jesse, standing silent beside his family, the bronze star gleaming against his weathered coat. "I didn't know, Frank muttered, his voice rough as he cleared his throat. He shifted uncomfortably, searching for words that felt inadequate. "Didn't know you were one of them." Jesse met his gaze, his expression calm but piercing. "One of who?" he asked quietly. "A soldier?" Frank's face flushed, but he pressed on. A good one, he said, the words carrying the weight of an apology he didn't know how to voice. Daniel stepped forward, his presence a bridge between the two men. He's more than that, Frank, he said, his tone free of judgment but firm in its truth. He's a husband, a father, a man who asked for nothing and gave more than most of us ever will. There was no trace of sarcasm in Frank's expression now, only the dawning realization of how wrong he'd been. One by one, others joined him. The gas station clerk who had once looked past Jesse as if he were invisible. The woman from the diner who had pretended not to notice Alicia cradling her baby in the bitter cold outside. They came bearing thermoses of hot soup, blankets, and apologies that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Their presence was enough, a quiet acknowledgement of the humanity they'd failed to see before. Rebecca, Daniel's daughter, stood near the porch, her breath visible in the frigid air as she watched the scene unfold. Her heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow, and she wiped a tear from her cheek before stepping forward. She joined Alicia, her hands steady as she helped unpack formula from one of the crates. Their shared silence, a bond forged in the moment. Nearby, Michael, Rebecca's brother, approached Jesse with a quiet nod. "You staying here a while?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Just until I can get the van running," Jesse replied, his tone cautious, as if he still couldn't trust the kindness being offered. "No rush," Michael said, the words surprising even himself. There was no urgency in his voice, only an unspoken invitation to stay, to belong. The general turned to Daniel, his eyes warm with respect. "You've always been good at leading from the front," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent side by side. Daniel shrugged, his modesty genuine. "Didn't do anything special," he said, brushing off the praise. "You did more than most," the general countered, his words firm. "You reminded them who they are. You showed them the truth." In a town that had grown cold, not from the biting winter, but from forgetting what truly mattered, one act of quiet compassion had sparked a fire. It wasn't the roaring blaze of grand gestures, but the steady glow of recognition, of community, of redemption, for Jesse, for Alicia, for their children, and for the neighbors who now stood together. It was a warmth they hadn't felt in years, a promise that they could begin again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the snow-dusted fields, the Clayton Ranch stood as more than just a home. It had become a haven of redemption, a place where broken lives found solace and purpose. For years, it had been Daniel Clayton's anchor, a quiet refuge where he bore the weight of grief and memory. Now it pulsed with new life, its heartbeat quickened by the return of hope and the slow mending of wounded hearts. In the weeks that followed, the ranch found a rhythm that felt like a melody from a forgotten past. Before dawn's first light touched the frost-covered hills, Jesse was already at work. He cleared the driveway of snow, his breath visible in the biting air, and fed the livestock with a tenderness that went beyond obligation. Each swing of his axe as he split firewood, each nail he hammered into weathered fences, was a deliberate act of repair, not just for the land, but for the shattered fragments of his own soul. He moved with a quiet resolve, as if every task was a step towards stitching together the man he'd lost somewhere along the way. For Jesse, the ranch was more than shelter. It was a mirror showing him glimpses of who he could still be. From the porch, Daniel observed, his calloused hands cradling a steaming coffee mug. His eyes, lined with the marks of hard winters and harder choices, traced Jesse's steady movements. He could have taken up the work himself, his body was still capable, but he chose not to. Not out of weariness, but out of understanding. Jesse needed this labor, this purpose, and Daniel knew when to let another man carry the load. Pride and relief stirred in his chest, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Margaret's death had draped the ranch in silence. The bunkhouse, once a dim, neglected relic, now brimmed with life. Emma, barely 10 but fierce with determination, helped her mother, Alessia, with the laundry. She'd learned to tend the wood stove, her small hands deftly stoking the flames, her face glowing with pride at each crackle. She moved with the assurance of a child who'd found her role, her laughter sweeping away the shadows that had lingered in the corners. Thomas, younger and brimming with curiosity, followed Daniel like a puppy, his endless questions about lambing, hay bales, the way the wind carried the scent of pine, filling the air. His voice, light and free, chased the stillness from the fields. Even baby Grace, who'd arrived with a cough that shook her fragile body, had grown stronger. Her cries had softened into bright, unexpected giggles, a sound that warmed the frigid air. Winter's chill was fierce, but Jesse fought it with quiet determination. He'd found part-time work in town with a local contractor. The wages were small, just enough for guests and a few essentials, but they restored a piece of his pride. Each paycheck felt like a step toward reclaiming the dignity he'd lost in years of struggle. Alicia, too, found her own path to healing. She baked pies, golden, fragrant with apples and cinnamon, and shared them with neighbors who'd once judged her from a distance. Those neighbors now welcomed her gifts with genuine smiles, their prejudices melting with each bite. Her pies weren't just desserts. They were olive branches, forging connections where walls once stood. The ranch itself seemed to awaken under their care. Where the roof had bowed under years of neglect, Jesse strengthened the beams, his hammer echoing through the cold. Where the fields had cracked and dried, he and Daniel dug new irrigation lines, their hands raw but determined. The land responded, sprouting delicate green shoots that hinted at spring's promise, a reflection of the hope blossoming in those who worked it. The people, too, were transforming, their hearts softening, their bonds strengthening in ways they hadn't anticipated. One Saturday afternoon, with the sun casting a soft glow over the snow, Daniel and Jesse sat side by side on the porch. Before the bunkhouse, Emma and Thomas were shaping a snowman, their voices rising in playful debate. Emma wrapped a scarf around its neck, insisting it needed flair. Thomas, earnest and stubborn, argued for boots. Jesse held his coffee mug, its warmth seeping into his rough hands, and broke the silence. "I keep thinking about that first night," he said, his voice low, almost unsure, "when I knocked on your door." Daniel kept his gaze on the children, his expression guarded. "What about it?" Jesse hesitated, searching for words to capture the weight of that moment. "You didn't even think twice. Didn't know me at all. Had no reason to let me in. But you did." His voice wavered, thick with emotion. "I was done, Daniel. Nowhere left to turn." Daniel let out a slow breath, as if releasing a memory long held. "You ever been so low that one person's kindness feels like air?" he asked, his voice rough but steady. Jesse nodded, his eyes on the horizon. Daniel went on, each word heavy with meaning. "In '93, I broke down outside Cheyenne. VA check was late. Margaret and the kids were in the car, cold and hungry. I was at a gas station feeling like the world had given up on me. An old woman came up, gave me $10. Didn't ask questions, just said, 'Someone helped me once. You'll help someone else.'" Jesse turned to him, his eyes searching Daniel's weathered face. "And now you did." Daniel shook his head, his gaze softening as he watched Emma and Thomas laugh beside their crooked snowman. "No," he said softly. "Now we did." In that quiet, frost-covered moment, two men, soldiers shaped by different battles, marked by different wounds, shared a truth that few ever grasp. Service didn't end with a uniform or a flag. It lived in what came after, in fences mended, in children's warmth, in strangers who became kin. Heroism wasn't always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it was as simple as a door opened in the dark, a hand extended at the end of a lonely driveway. Daniel Clayton hadn't saved a country or commanded armies. But he'd opened a door, and in that small, unassuming act, he'd sparked something profound, not just for Jesse, but for a town that had forgotten how to care. Service, he'd shown them, wasn't about glory or recognition. Sometimes it was just one man giving what he could, with no expectation of return. The wind howled across the barren fields, carrying whispers of frost and forgotten dreams. Jesse Turner stood at the edge of the old ranch, his tattered uniform clinging to his frame like a ghost of who he'd once been. Shame weighed heavier than the threadbare fabric, pressing down on shoulders that had long since forgotten how to stand proud. He wasn't looking for handouts or hollow sympathy. All he craved was a moment to breathe, a chance to be seen, not as a failure, not as a relic of mistakes, but as a man still fighting to hold on to something human within him. His eyes, dulled by years of rejection and silence, scanned the horizon, searching for a lifeline in a world that had turned its back. Daniel Harper, the quiet rancher who owned this patch of frozen earth, wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. His life was simple, carved out of long days tending to cattle and mending fences under a sky that never judged. He had little to offer in the way of wealth or status, just a modest home and a heart that refused to grow callous despite the hardness of the world. When he spotted Jesse that morning standing like a shadow against the snow-dusted fence, something stirred in him. Not pity, Daniel had no use for that. It was recognition, a flicker of understanding that this stranger wasn't just passing through. He was a man adrift, carrying wounds no one else could see. Daniel's boots crunched through the snow as he approached, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He didn't ask questions or demand explanations. Instead, he offered a nod, the kind that said, "I see you." For Jesse, that small gesture cracked open a door he'd thought was locked forever. The weight of being invisible, of being dismissed by a world too busy to care, began to lift, if only slightly. In that moment, Daniel's quiet courage became a bridge, one built not with grand speeches or flashy promises, but with the simple act of showing up when no one else would. As the days passed, Jesse found a place to land on that ranch. Daniel gave him work, not out of charity, but because he believed in the power of purpose. Splitting wood, repairing the van, feeding the livestock. Each task was a thread, weaving Jesse back into the fabric of a life he'd thought was lost. With every swing of the axe, he felt the shame loosen its grip, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of worth. At night, sitting by the fire in Daniel's small kitchen, Jesse would talk. Haltingly at first, then with a quiet intensity, he shared fragments of his story, years of service, battles fought, in the slow erosion of pride in a society that forgot its soldiers. Daniel listened, not with judgment, but with a steady presence that said, "You're still here. That matters." For Daniel, the decision to help wasn't a calculation. It came from a place deeper than reason, a conviction that turning away from someone in need would diminish him as much as it would them. He thought of his own past, of moments when he'd stumbled, when the world had felt too heavy, and someone somewhere had offered a hand. Those memories fueled him, reminding him that kindness wasn't a transaction, but a legacy. As he watched Jesse regain a spark of confidence, Daniel felt a quiet pride, not in himself, but in the truth that even the smallest act of faith in another person could ripple outward, touching lives he'd never know. The town noticed. Neighbors who'd once kept their heads down began to talk. The kids, bundled up against the cold, watched from the school bus as Jesse worked alongside Daniel, their young minds piecing together a lesson no classroom could teach. That redemption wasn't a fairy tale, but a choice made in the grit of everyday life. When the snow finally melted and the van roared back to life, it wasn't just metal and oil that had been fixed. Something deeper had shifted, for Jesse, for Daniel, and for the community that bore witness. The ranch, once just a quiet plot of land, became a symbol of something rare and enduring. A place where second chances weren't just given, but lived. Long after the military convoy rolled out of town and the uniforms were packed away, the ranch flew a different kind of flag. Not one of cloth or insignia, but one woven from restored dignity, rebuilt trust, and the unspoken truth that real honor didn't come from titles or medals. It was earned in the quiet moments, when a man said yes to helping another, even when the world shouted no. In a society that raced forward, eyes fixed on screens and schedules, it was easy to overlook the broken, to assume their pain wasn't your burden. But Jesse and Daniel's story stood as a reminder. Doing what's right rarely demanded fanfare, but it always left a mark. From that unlikely meeting, a weathered veteran and a humble rancher, came a quiet revolution. Jesse walked taller, his eyes no longer fixed on the ground. Daniel, though he'd never admit it, felt his own life grow richer, as if giving someone a chance had unlocked something within him too. And the town, once fractured by indifference, began to remember what it meant to be a community. Not just a collection of houses, but a tapestry of lives bound by compassion. In the end, their story wasn't about grand gestures or heroic feats. It was about showing up, about seeing the person behind the pain, and about believing that no one was too far gone to be brought back.